Thank you all so much for joining us for today's training on Social Security insurance, Social Security disability insurance, and long COVID, presented in partnership with Body Politic. This training will be led by Ann Callaghy from the Legal Aid Society and Barbara Comerford and Carlissa Prettyman from the law offices of Barbara B. Comerford. If this is your first time at one of our events, I want to just really briefly explain who we are. The Health and Housing Consortium is a collaborative network of healthcare, homeless, social service organizations, and government partners. And we work together to create cross-sector relationships, inform policy, and really build the capacity of frontline workers to support our ultimate goal of improving health equity and housing stability. So Bonnie, if you want to, oh, good, we're still here. So just a few housekeeping things. So as I said, please try and keep on mute throughout this presentation unless you have a question, and just let me know in the chat. Feel free to share resources, comments, and questions throughout the presentation. If you have any questions in there, I will make sure we get to it at the appropriate times. To enable or disable subtitles, you can, oh, this is my bad, here we go. I'm enabling a live transcript, so you can have subtitles at the bottom, and you can enable that at the bottom of your screen. And then just a heads up, at the very end, we're going to ask that you complete a really brief evaluation poll and survey. One other thing, this is a 2-hour-long training, so I encourage you all to take breaks as needed. Turn your camera off, walk around, do what you need to do to support your own learning and health as we go about this. Next slide, Bonnie. So we're doing our overview now, then we're going to learn about SSI and SSDI for about 35 minutes. We'll have a brief Q&A, and then we'll go in and learn about long COVID, the symptoms, and how that relates to benefits. And then we'll have another Q&A where you can ask any of our presenters questions, and then we'll close. Next slide. And I just want to say a quick word about our partner, Body Politic. Body Politic is a queer feminist wellness collective that shifted in the wake of COVID-19 to advocate for people who have been historically marginalized in the health, medicine, and wellness spaces. Body Politic offers a virtual peer support group for COVID patients and caretakers with over 25,000 participants. They lead patient-led research and public education, as well as community-based advocacy. So I really encourage you all, whether you are clinicians and social workers, whether you have COVID yourself or know people who do, to check them out because they have a lot of amazing resources. And you can see their Twitter and Instagram handles on the slides, but I will also drop their website in the chat. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anne to lead the first part of our training.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Callaghy. I'm the director of the government benefits practice at the Legal Aid Society. I have done a similar training for the Bronx Consortium for a number of years, and so I might know some of you. It's a little weird remotely because I don't see most of you, but I hope that you'll find this informative. We could go to the next slide. And these are the basic topics that I am going to talk about for the next half hour or so. I think it's benefits that you deal with your clients. SSI is supplemental security income, and SSD is Social Security disability. We'll talk about the similarities and differences in those benefits. We'll talk about how to apply for them, how to appeal a denial, what is the criteria Social Security uses to find that somebody meets the disability definition, and then a couple of miscellaneous issues. We could go on to the next slide. For your advocacy purposes, these are some key resources, phone numbers, websites that our advocates find helpful. The SSA.gov website is a good one. It has all of its rules. It has some know your rights kinds of things. They are pretty clear and they're pretty thorough. Social Security's toll-free number is here. Also, if you're needing to find which field office belongs to your client or what phone number and fax goes with that field office, I have a website here where you can plug in your client's zip code and find the field office for them and a phone number at which during COVID, a live person's actually answering the phone number. But it's not the same as the phone numbers that were used pre-COVID, like pre-March 2020. So it's worth looking it up. If you have trouble getting a response from a field office, getting in touch with a field office for any number of issues, Social Security has public affairs specialists. Their emails, names and emails are listed at the website I've given on this slide, and they are very helpful. We reach out to them. These are, and they usually get the field office to respond to us pretty quickly because that's what their job is, and they're pretty good at it. There are public affairs specialists and for the different regions. So, the Legal Aid Society works with New York City and the 5 boroughs. So, but I think there are public affairs specialists listed for the various regions. So there may be some for New Jersey too, but I'm not familiar with those. The New York regional office has an email that also can be helpful in getting them to get field offices to respond to us. If you're trying to figure out what hearing office your client's hearing is likely to be held at, I also have the locator for that too. So we can move on to the next slide. We have here just sort of an outline of some of the differences between SSI and SSD. As I said, SSI is supplemental security income. It was created by Title 16 of the Social Security Act, as opposed to Social Security disability benefits, which come under Title 2 of the Social Security Act. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as DIB, disability insurance benefits. Somebody's asking if the slides will be available afterwards, and that's fine with me to send them to everybody by email, but we could probably arrange that with Tess and Bonnie. Supplemental security income is essentially a federal welfare program for people who are too disabled to work. And so, as with other welfare programs, it's a much more restricted, has more restrictive rules when it comes to the non-disability and financial elements of eligibility than SSD does. SSD is a program created for people who have paid into the Social Security system long enough, generally 10 years of work on the books, paying Social Security taxes, such that when they become disabled, they get Social Security disability benefits. A person can also get a combination of SSI and SSD benefits, as you may know from some of your clients. SSI is a means-based program for what is considered terms of art the aged, blind, or disabled. In order to determine eligibility beyond whether somebody's disabled, they have to have the right level of income and resources, essentially under $2,000 or $3,000 for an elderly couple. If I qualify for SSI, none of my dependents get paid on my account. It just goes with the individual person. Whereas if I get Social Security disability benefits, my dependent children, the other parent of dependent children, and my spouse, depending on certain other criteria, could all be paid on my account. So the idea is that an SSD recipient used to work and is now unable to work, and all the people who depended on me being a worker are need support. So that's the idea of derivative benefits there. The earliest date I can be paid, depending on the program, also differs and is a bit more restrictive. So for SSI, I can only be paid starting with the month after the month in which I apply. I will also say again that a person could apply for concurrent benefits. They could get SSI and SSD. And most of our clients who get that, it's because they may have had very low wage work. And so they paid into the Social Security system and qualify for a level of SSD, but it's a very low monthly level. And it doesn't rise to the amount of SSI. SSI monthly benefits are statutorily set. And so currently, an SSI recipient can at most get $794 a month. So if my SSD amount based on my past work is less than $794, I would be allowed to get an SSI supplement up to the SSI level. And I see Barbara is answering and writing in the chat. My ability to speak and write simultaneously is too limited, so I appreciate her writing that. The application methods also are a bit more restricted for SSI, and we'll talk about that too. We could go on to the next slide. How SSI and SSD are similar is that the programs use the same definition of disability. The medical evidence, therefore, to prove disability that you need is the same, and the appeals process is the same. The appeals process is generally, you apply. If your application is denied, you request a reconsideration, and that happens at the field office level, that local Social Security office level. We'll talk a bit about that. If that is denied, a person can have a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. If you get an unfavorable decision from the judge, a person is entitled to ask the Social Security Appeals Council to review the decision. If they decline to review the decision, a person can go to federal court and file an appeal. The first 3 levels are within Social Security. Sorry. And once you're in federal court, you're outside of the Social Security system. We can go on to the next slide. Okay. One of the ways people can apply for SSI and SSD is online on the Social Security website. But it depends a little bit on whether you're free to do that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. People can also apply by calling the 1-800 number. An application essentially is done by phone with a follow-up phone interview. We can move on to the next slide. In COVID, as you know, most agencies are doing things remotely, and Social Security is no exception. So they are not really having walk-in appointments at local field offices. Our clients used to be able to just go in and get on a very long line and be seen. but that can't happen now. There are instances in which claimants can go to their local Social Security office. They can request an in-person appointment by calling their local Social Security office, but they need to, or we can for them, describe what their dire need is. And that's in quotes because that is a term of art that Social Security uses. And it is for claimants who are without food or shelter, including utilities, or without medical care or medical coverage, and they need to apply for or reinstate their benefits, or they currently receive benefits and they have an urgent need for payment to meet expenses for any of those items. So dire need is a specific and much smaller category of people who are allowed to go in. The problem is, it is possible in that circumstance to get an appointment, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen today or tomorrow. So they may be waiting anyway. It's on an emergency basis, but it doesn't happen in COVID in emergency timing necessarily. So we can move on to the next slide. These are the distinctions between who can apply for adult disability online. And for SSI, a person can apply for adult disability benefits online if they meet these criteria. They're between the ages of 18 and 65, have never been married, are not blind. It's a separate category of disability. They're a US citizen and they reside in one of these places. They have not applied for or received SSI in the past, and they are applying for SSD at the same time, so a concurrent application. So you see that there are restrictions. It's not, and if you don't meet these, you can't apply online for SSI. SSD,
Hi, if you're not speaking, can you please mute? Thank you. Sorry, Anne, go ahead.
No problem. This is what we've been doing for a year, right? For SSD, it's looser. You can apply for adult disability benefits online if you're 18 or older. If you're not currently getting Social Security on your own record, you might be getting it on a spouse's record or a parent's. You can't work, so you meet the definition of disability, and you haven't been denied disability benefits in the last 60 days. So it's much looser as to who can apply online for SSD. Okay, and we could move on to the next slide. So some of this is the nuts and bolts, because I'm assuming that as advocates, some of your role is to apply and help people apply, or to advise them when they are doing that. And in COVID, most people will be applying online or by telephone. After a person applies online, Social Security will mail the claimant a notice with an interview date, which will be done by phone. In our office, we have a group of paralegals who help people apply under a certain grant program. And they find that they can speed up the interview scheduling by calling the field office about a week after they've submitted the application, confirm submission of the application, and schedule the interview. So it alleviates the same waiting time. We could move on to the next slide. During the application process, Social Security is supposed to gather medical evidence. To that end, they will send our claimants, our clients, release forms to sign, which meet the HIPAA requirements, so they can collect records from doctors that are treating our clients. Social Security also schedules consultative examinations. They contract with doctors, mental health doctors and physical doctors, Um, Clients. In COVID, it's a little different. In COVID, mental health exams, I understand, at least in New York, are being done remotely by video. In COVID, physical health exams are done in person at this point, but a claimant can choose not to go for COVID reasons. The problem is not going can negatively affect the outcome of an application. So it is up to the claimant to decide the kind of risks involved and whether it's worth it or not. If an application is denied, obviously a person does have appeal rights. We kind of work with our clients to make that, to help them make that decision for themselves. A disability analyst in New York at the state agency, the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, OTDA, is the one who reviews the medical evidence and makes the medical decision on the case. It is possible for us who are assisting with an application to speak to that disability analyst, to highlight evidence that we think should have them render a favorable disability determination. We also, as advocates and representatives on applications, will write a letter of advocacy pointing out what the evidence is and why they should find our clients disabled. We can move on to the next slide. At the application stage, we can help our clients gather medical evidence and doctor reports on which a doctor will state what their opinion is of how severe the claimant's condition is, and we can send that information to the disability analyst. Send it to the disability analyst and not to the local Social Security office, because it is the disability analyst who will make that medical decision. Once an application is submitted, the claimant and you, if you're listed as a representative, and we could talk about how that can be done later, will get a notice from the disability analyst with that person's name and contact information, and you can contact them once you have that information. We can move to the next slide. You can help a claimant by being their authorized representative, which means you and they are signing an appointment of representative form. That form can be found online at ssa.gov. And it can be submitted by mail or fax to the local Social Security field office. Again, you can use the field office locator to find which is your client's office. In COVID, Social Security has developed a new electronic 1696, which is the form number of the appointment of representative form, which can be submitted online. It does mean that to have this work, your client does need a working email address. I know that's challenging, but some of our clients have that. For those who do, the representative signs the form, submits it, and then the form gets sent by Social Security to the claimant, who then can sign it and send it back. There is a more detailed explanation of this at the link I've provided here. Now, if you are not prepared for any variety of reasons to be the full representative, we can have our clients sign what's called a consent for release of information form, and it's form number 3288, also found at ssa.gov. And what that allows us is to, it gives Social Security permission to speak to us about the case. So we have the right to look at a file. We have the right to ask questions about the case based on that. Sometimes field offices don't understand that this does give them permission to talk to us. And then sometimes we need to do some advocacy with one of those public affairs specialists that I had in one of the earlier slides. Move on. Um, the evidence I'm talking about to prove disability includes opinions from medical sources like psychiatrists and therapists and doctors and social workers. Um, when it's a child's case, but we're really thinking mostly about adult cases now, but it can also be opinions from teachers. It can be ongoing treatment records from any number of medical sources, both for mental health and physical health. We can also collect, old school records. We have adult clients who have intellectual disability, who were in special ed in New York City. And we have, I think in a subsequent slide, the contact information for how you would get their old special ed records, because if you can prove that they had intellectual disability prior to age 22, they could be found disabled under that criteria. It's also possible to at different times get people's housing records and documentation for people who are in, let's say, NYCHA housing, or they're in special supportive housing. Getting those records, and some of you I think probably work in supported housing programs. You know that records will show what kind of assistance people get and need in their everyday life, and that can help show what their limitations are. We can move on. This is the contact information for New York City special ed. I am told by our practitioners that they have been successful in getting special ed records during COVID. We can move on. If the application is denied, this will be sent in a notice by Social Security to the claimant. If you are listed as a representative having filled out a 1696 form, you should also get a copy. And that notice contains appeal rights and what the appeal deadlines are. We can move on. A claimant in COVID can appeal in a number of ways. I have outlined and did before the 4 levels of appeal. An appeal can be filed at any level except for federal court, because that is outside Social Security system. It can be appealed online at the link I've included here. You can see the reconsideration, the hearing requests, the request of the Appeals Council are all on this webpage. The appeal can be filed online or download one of the forms and fax it to a local Social Security office. It could be mailed to a local office. I'm not that hot on mail delivery in COVID because there are great delays and mail gets lost. To me, we have found that the most reliable way to file an appeal right now is online, because there's no paper to get lost in any office on any fax machine. Obviously, if a claimant doesn't have access to technology, then we do it those other ways, or they do it those other ways if we're not representing them. Time limits are very important to pay attention to. At every level of appeal, the time limit is 60 days plus 5 days from the date of the denial notice. The 5 days is for mailing. And there is this concept of good cause that Social Security has in its regulations and its policies, that if the appeal is late, they do ask, did circumstances cause a delay in why the person filed late? Did Social Security's actions mislead the claimant into not understanding what their deadline was? And was there any way in which the claimant's mental or physical disability or language limitations lead them to appeal late? In COVID, Social Security has repeatedly emphasized that they're being more flexible in finding good cause for missing deadlines, both at the field office level, at the hearing office level, and at the appeals council or the AC levels. So we recommend that if your client has filed late, that the claimant make a statement about why that is, what went into the late filing, so that Social Security can consider that. We can move to the next slide. So this is a slightly greater elaboration on good cause, which most of which I have gone over. For a level of any level of appeal where you or the claimant is late, if you haven't included or they haven't included a written statement of why, they will send a notice saying, please tell us why. And they will give 30 days from the date of that request, even though I think that notice has a standard language that's less than 30 days. In COVID, they're giving 30 days to have that returned to them, which in their mind is accounting for the possible mail delay. We could move on. So I'm going through like all the mishaps. If a claimant misses their hearing when it was scheduled, all is not lost. The claimant should call the hearing office right away at the number listed on the hearing notice. They can also, if they don't have the hearing notice, the number can be found at the hearing office locator, which we include here. Again, to reiterate, they can tell what happened, what their good cause reason is for missing the hearing, and they will be mailed something on which they can write down what the reason is. As their advocate, whether or not you're their official representative, you can help them to compose the written statement of what happened. They may have been too sick to attend. They may have had a family member sick. They may have forgotten, and if memory is an issue that is involved in their disability, that can be a legitimate reason. Whatever the reason is, detailing it helps. We can move on. Hearings in COVID since last March have been held by telephone. Social Security is also beginning to hold them by video. There are no in-person hearings being held now. Claimants do have the right to say, I do not want a remote hearing either by phone or video, and they have the right to an in-person hearing, but they would have to understand that the wait for an in-person hearing is going to be a long one. So again, they have to weigh the benefit of an in-person hearing against the benefit of having it happen sooner than later. The downsides, as you easily understand, of having a phone hearing is they need, and a video hearing, they need the technology in order to have them. They need enough minutes on their phones. They need a place where they can do it in privacy so that all their confidential information is not broadcast either to the rest of the family or to strangers. So it's a lot to consider. We have done some phone hearings at the Legal Aid Society successfully. They are not without their complications. Audio is sometimes not working very well. A number of people have to be on the line at once: the judge's assistant, the claimant, the representative, sometimes an interpreter, sometimes an expert who's going to testify. So there are things that go wrong, and when things go wrong, sometimes the judges have said, not working today, we need to adjourn this to another day. In other instances, it has worked and hearings have been held and decisions rendered. We can move on. So now we're getting into what it takes to be found disabled. And I know that it may be that my time is running short, but this is definition of disability for Social Security. You have to show that you can't do full-time work at a certain level of earnings because you have a medically determinable physical or mental condition that's expected to either last at least 12 months or basically end in death. There are non-medical criteria for SSI. You have to have low enough income, low enough resources, and the right immigration status. For SSD, you have to have enough work orders. You have to have worked enough to have paid into the system. So we can move on. Social Security does what it calls a 5-step sequential evaluation of a claimant's medical condition. We can move on to the next slide. And they ask 5 questions. They ask, is the claimant engaging in SGA, which is substantial gainful activity, which is a certain level of earnings? And if they are, you can see that the case gets denied. Well, if you're able to work, you're not disabled, you don't get benefits. If they are not, then the next question is, does the claimant have a severe impairment or combination of impairments, medical impairments? If the answer is no, the case gets denied. If the answer is yes, Social Security moves on to say, does the claimant's impairments meet or equal a listing? That is a set of listed impairments. We'll go on to describe that in a moment. If yes, they get benefits. If no, the judge and Social Security move on to say, can the claimant return to any past work they've done in the last 15 years? If yes, then they're not disabled. They could go do their past work. If no, Social Security says, well, given your age and education and past work, is there any other work you could do? If yes, then you don't get benefits. If there is no other work, then you do get benefits. We can move on to the next slide. We talked about SGA, substantial gainful activity, in 2020. For non-blind claimants, it was $1,260 a month earnings. And this year, it's $1,310 a month earnings. If a person is making that much or more, they are working to such a degree that they would be found not disabled. We can move on. To be severe, a claimant has to have a mental or physical condition that limits a basic work activity. It is a de minimis standard. So to pass this second question, you just have to have something that limits your walking, standing, sitting, lifting, pushing, pulling, the various things that are listed here, your ability to see or hear, your ability to exercise judgment, to respond appropriately to other people. If any of these is compromised in any way, you have a severe impairment. It also has to last long enough. It can't be 3 months this was the case and now I'm fine. We'll move on. The third step is, does it meet or equal a listed impairment? And we'll move on to the next slide to show you that Social Security has broken down the body systems into all these segments. And they have very specific criteria under all of these segments about what you would have to show medically to say that you meet a listing for a musculoskeletal problem, like a back problem, like a herniated disc, or like a respiratory disorder, like asthma or COPD. We can move on. If a person doesn't meet a listing or equal a listing, they ask, can a person perform their past work? And that is the work they've done in the last 15 years. And Social Security talks about something called a residual functional capacity. Do they have, what is the greatest level exertional level of work they can do, given all of their limitations. We can move on. If the person cannot do their past work, can they perform any other work? And what comes into play here is the claimant's residual functional capacity. Can they do only sitting, sedentary jobs, light jobs, medium jobs? How old are they? How much education? How much past work? Is there anything else they can do? And they look at something called the Medical Vocational Guidelines, or the grids, because it really is a chart. We'll move on. You can see here exertional levels have definitions of what is sedentary, light, medium, and heavy, and they correspond to what you might think. Sedentary is mostly sitting all day, not lifting much weight. Light is mostly standing all day, lifting a bit more weight, up to 20 pounds, and so on. It goes up to medium heavy and very heavy. We can move on. They divide age into categories of younger worker, closely approaching advanced age, and closely approaching retirement age. We can move on. They divide education into marginal, limited, high school, and more than high school. And all of these go into their assessment of whether or not somebody could adjust to doing other work. The older you are, the less education you have, the less work you have in your past, the less likely it is you're going to be able to adjust to other work. The younger you are, the more education you have, and the more work or skilled work you have, the more likely they're going to find you could adjust to other work. And we'll look at an example on the next slide. If a claimant has been found like they could only do a sitting job, sedentary work, they could sit 6 hours and lift up to 10 pounds frequently. And I know I'm going sort of lightning speed and very general, but you can see the difference here, how it shakes out. If the client is 53, which is closely approaching advanced age, has a 10th grade education, which is considered limited, they dropped out at that point, and they have unskilled or no past work, they will be considered disabled under a grid rule. And if you look at the grids, you'll see this. If that same person is 53 but completed high school and has the same level of work, they'll be considered not disabled because it's going to be thought that having completed high school, they will be able to adjust to other work. Okay, we're going to move on. Let's see where we are. I see 3:46 that I probably have to stop soon.
Okay. Do a couple more minutes. I know you have more to get through.
Okay, so I want to briefly say, okay, that Social Security has to consider the medical evidence that it is presented with, either that it collects itself or that we or the claimant submit on their behalf. For older applications, they used to give preference, essentially, to the opinion of a physician who actually treats the claimant. And now they've changed that rule. And now they have to consider not the treating physician's opinions in a special way, but they have to consider all medical source opinions and decide whether they are persuasive, whether they are supported by the other evidence, and whether they are consistent with the other evidence. So it's not as great an advantage to claimants the way they have construed it now. We will move on. If a claimant has a history of drug addiction or alcohol, and if that is part of what makes them disabled, if it's a contributing factor that's material to the disability, they will be denied benefits. So it is important to get a treating physician's opinion, and we can move on to the next page, of these 3 questions. Is there alcohol or substance abuse in the patient's history? If yes, is it in remission? If not, um, the opinion about whether, if the abuse or substance use stopped, would the patient continue to have disabling conditions? If the answer is yes, then it's possible to argue that they meet disability criteria. If but for the alcohol or drug use, they would not be disabled. They will not be found disabled and eligible for benefits. A potential problem that we see, and I guess I'm close to the end here, earnings records. Sometimes our clients, even if they did not work, have an earnings record registered. And we have found that our SSI claimants have sometimes either filed IRS tax forms and gotten an earned income tax credit. Sometimes they have done this because they've been told they're eligible. Sometimes they've done it because family members have done it on their behalf. But if they have earnings listed that don't belong to them, it can cause great problems in their application. There are ways to deal with it. They can amend past tax returns and earnings records. They can make a statement to Social Security that this is an error. They want to be careful what they say to Social Security. They don't want to say that I filed false tax forms, but they can say that this is an error and I'm correcting it. We will move on to one last thing. I was going to touch on the federal economic impact payments. To alert you, if you don't know, that there can be an automatic payment of $1,400 made to current recipients of Social Security Disability, SSI, and Social Security Retirement. There are non-automatic payments of a child's benefit of that, and that involves filing a tax form for them in which they are you claim them as a dependent. This money is not counted as income or for SSI, so it doesn't make people ineligible. And for people on SSI, they would have to spend it within 12 months, and then after that, it's counted as a resource, but it won't hurt them for eligibility purposes for 12 months. So that was lightning speed, but I think we're at the end. That's my contact information. If you have questions in the future, or you have a claimant who needs representation at a hearing, you can refer them to us.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I know a lot of information you had to pack in there, so we really appreciate it. Before we move on to talk about how this connects with COVID, we do have some questions for you. We're going to take a few minutes to do that.
Okay.
This question, it might be more of a follow-up question that you email us later, or, the consortium figures it out, but someone's wondering if you know of any organizations that can help with the application process for folks in the Bronx, Manhattan, Newark, and Paterson, New Jersey. So.
Okay, well, one thing I'll say is that if a person is in New York City and they're on HRA benefits, cash assistance and SNAP, they can ask HRA to deem them homebound, and then they could be referred to the Legal Aid Society. Other groups outside of that, we do some applications, but Sydney is another group that does applications routinely in New York City. So those are the two responses off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. And we'll follow up with more. So someone is wondering what you do if you miss the appeals deadline.
Well, so at any level, a written statement to the field office if it's a reconsideration request, or to the hearing office if it's a hearing request, or to the appeals council if it's at that level. The most important thing is a written statement signed by the claimant detailing what happened. And maybe it's the person couldn't read the notice and had no one to read it to them. And because of literacy issues, because of cognitive issues. Maybe a person suffers from depression and has memory issues or dementia. Maybe a person was in the hospital. Maybe the person lacks technology, uh, has physical disabilities that made them unable to leave the home to get help. Like, you see how almost whatever the story is, however much detail they can put in, they can say, this is my good cause reason for missing the deadline.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions about the age of 65. Someone asked if benefits terminate when you turn 65. Someone asked some other questions about that, and I'm wondering if you could clarify.
So SSI, for people who haven't, so I'm thinking this is an SSI related
Yes.
question for people who don't have a work history. So up until 65, you have to prove that you're disabled. At 65, you don't. You can just get the SSI benefits based on age. So it's a much simpler application. You just have to show your age. At 65, benefits don't terminate. They just sort of switch over to being old age benefits. But the amount doesn't really change if it's straight SSI. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And whoever asked that question, if you have, oh, someone asked if you can apply for SSI at 62.
Yes, you can apply at 62, but it's that number triggers to me retirement age. And SSI has nothing to do with retirement because it had nothing to do with work in the first place. So you could apply at any age, but at 62, because you're less than 65, you are going to have to prove that you're disabled. Having said that, people over 60 who have a medical condition will be found disabled much more easily than somebody under 60, just as somebody over 50 will be found disabled more easily than somebody under 50.
Okay. Someone's asking if you file taxes while you receive SSI and SSD.
My understanding is a person does not have to file taxes, but I'm not a tax expert, and maybe Barbara knows better than I do. So I'd want to double check. On SSI, no.
Okay. We will follow up on that. I see,
Okay.
well, I know we have a ton of questions. We're going to take just one more, and then we're going to go into our other presentation, and then we're going to come back at the end, everyone. So
Okay.
don't worry. I'll take two more. Someone wants to make sure that they understand that SSI is only for people who are disabled but don't have a work history.
Essentially, that's true. It also, everybody, you have to be disabled to get SSI if you're under 65. And the no work history is true, except that you could have a work history and qualify for a very low level of SSD. And at which point you could get SSI as a supplement to just bring you up to the SSI monthly amount. So you could get a combination. So you could have had a work history that's not paying you very much in SSD benefits.
And someone is kind of specific, but someone's wondering, they have a client, they have a client that could use legal aid assistance regarding his Medicaid, regarding Medicaid. Would Legal Aid Society be able to help them?
Yes, so I can give you after this our access to benefits helpline, which is open Monday through Friday, 10 to 3, and we take calls for many things, including Medicaid issues.
Perfect.
We also take them for SSI issues.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Anne. Everyone, so sorry we haven't gotten to all the questions, but I want to make sure that our other presenters are able to speak, so we'll come back to your questions later on. So now I'm going to have Barbara and Carlissa turn on the cameras and join us.
Hello? Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. So Can you go to the next slide, or do I go to it? Okay, so she kind of explained thoroughly the difference between SSI versus SSD. So I just wanted to note that a younger individual, you don't have to have as many recent work credits. So let's say you're 24, and if you have, if you have 6 credits earned, okay, so basically when you're a younger individual, I'm like messing up. Okay. You have to have half of the credits between the time you've been working since the age of 21. So for example, if you became disabled at the age of 27, you would need credits for 3 years of work. So 6 out of the last 12 years. Okay, so then can you go to and for Social Security disability, typically you have to have a certain amount of recent work credits, which is 5 out of the last 10 years. Also, somebody had discussed at 62, could you get disability? So for Social Security disability, once you hit the age of 62, or right before you hit 62, it's good to apply for disability if you're disabled, because with the early retirement and the disability, you can get the full retirement amount and you won't get penalized for getting the early retirement if you're eligible for Social Security disability. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? Okay. So if you're statutorily blind, the recent work credit kind of freezes. So if you were ever insured for Social Security disability, it will freeze, and you can be eligible for Social Security disability. So let's say you stopped working in 2010, or wait, I'll give the example that's on the slide. So Mariah stopped working in 2012, but her primary impairment is a rare eye disorder that causes her statutory blindness. Because she was insured then, that onset date freezes and she is eligible for Social Security disability. So that's just an exception. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, so Anne also discussed this. So some people who became disabled prior to the age of 22 can be eligible for disabled adult child benefits versus SSI can typically be more. So in order to be eligible for disabled adult child benefits, your parent has to be either deceased, on Social Security retirement, or on Social Security disability. You've been disabled before the age of 22, and you have not worked over 6 months at substantially gainful level, which right now is $13.10 a month, and you were never married. So this example, this is a potential who calls like every 3 months. So Stephen has a cognitive, this isn't his real name. Stephen has a cognitive disorder from childhood. He previously worked for 10 years as an electrician. He's 54 years old and both his parents are deceased. He's not eligible for disabled adult child benefits because he's worked for over 10 years. Plus, it would be really hard for him to, get medical records prior to the age of 22, unless he has it somewhere in his attic or something. However, Michael is 25 years old and has bipolar disorder, which he's been treated for since the age of 17. He's never worked significantly. He can't really hold down a job due to the bipolar, and his dad is currently receiving Social Security disability benefit or Social Security retirement he can be eligible for disabled adult child benefits, which might be he could get, SSI and disabled adult child benefits, or he could get disabled adult child benefits. And sometimes disabled adult child benefits can be more advantageous than SSI because he can likely get a higher benefit. His benefit doesn't change based on his finances, and he can work under substantially work under substantially gainful level, and his amount won't get reduced. So substantially gainful activity currently is $1,310 a month. So you can't make more than that a month. I was just answering that. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so can someone collect unemployment while their disability case is pending? Due to COVID, almost a lot of people are getting unemployment right now. However, if you stopped working due to your disability, or shortly after you stopped working due to COVID, your condition worsened, you should apply for temporary disability through the state versus unemployment through the state. Since unemployment is through the state government, and you're saying you're ready, willing, able to work, and kind of poses an issue because with the Social Security disability, you're saying to the federal government that you're not able to work, and you have a condition that's preventing you from working for over a year. So currently, short-term disability in New York is 50% of your average wages for the last 8 weeks and maxes out at $170 a week. In New Jersey, the max amount for short-term disability is $637. So both short-term disability, for both New York and New Jersey, temporary disability lasts for 26 weeks. And unemployment currently is going until with the federal pandemic, it's going till September 5th, 2021. So, I mean, a lot of people are staying on the unemployment. So if you are to collect unemployment and also apply for Social Security disability, if the case goes to a hearing, a judge, is going to confront you about that as to why you gave conflicting information to unemployment and then also Social Security disability. So if you are on unemployment currently and you become disabled, I have both forms you can fill out and give to unemployment. So one is for the state of New York and the other is for the state of New Jersey. So just can we go to the next slide? Okay, so these are some of the impairments that kind of, and also policy holdings that you could possibly evaluate a COVID case under. However, they just established an emergency message recently as of April 16th as to how they'll review COVID cases. So if we can just go to that slide, that next slide. Okay, so in regards to COVID cases, so they describe COVID as primarily a respiratory disease. Emerging data suggests it can also affect cardiovascular, renal, dermatological, neurological, psychiatric, or other complications. So Barbara's going to really get into that as far as the symptoms and kind of impairments coinciding with that. So as Anne had talked about earlier, when Social Security evaluates Social Security cases, it's a 5-step, and supplemental security income cases, it's a 5-step sequential evaluation process. So you have to have a medically determinable condition that's expected to last for 12 months or is expected to end in death. So basically you have to be out of work for at least 12 months, at least under the substantially gainful level. With Social Security disability, there's also a 5-month waiting period before you become eligible for Social Security disability. So if, for instance, this is kind of a bad scenario, but if, for instance, somebody were to get COVID and then die in that 5-month period, then there's whoever could be entitled to benefits under their Social Security number is no longer entitled because they didn't satisfy that 5. So then also, the second step is you have to have the medically determinable impairment has to be severe enough to prevent you from engaging in substantially gainful activity. So with COVID, some of the things that they're looking for is a recent positive COVID test, a diagnostic test with findings consistent of COVID, such as a chest X-ray showing lung abnormalities. I would say a pulmonary function test too, something along those lines. A diagnosis of COVID with signs consistent with COVID-19, fever, cough, etc. We go to the next slide. Okay, so Anne had talked about this, the residual functional capacity. So the question kind of stands on the 4th step: is the individual able to perform their past work? So one thing, a lot of people are working from home right now, and let's say they have lupus or some other autoimmune issue. Social Security does not include that. It's not considered in the residual functional capacity. So that's something that kind of sucks. So then the final step, the 5th step, is can the person do any work in the national economy? And so Anne had said, there's certain rules that come into play as far as grid rules. When somebody gets older, that kind of erodes the 5th step a little bit. So that's, just another aspect. I think that's all of my slides. Okay, so then Barbara.
So I'm on now?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to just touch on a few answers to some of the questions that were asked previously that I wanted to respond to. And by the way, I wasn't typing while you were speaking, Anne, so I'm not exactly sure what that was. But let me just say that in response to the question about whether you file tax returns, I too am not an accountant, nor is Carlissa, nor is Anne, and that's generally our stock answer. But one of the things I explain to people is if you're collecting Social Security disability, as opposed to SSI, which is a needs-based program, if you're collecting Social Security disability, people who are very wealthy people can collect Social Security disability. So obviously the amount of income they generate depends on whether or not a tax return has to be filed. So I always tell them, talk to your accountant. If you don't have an accountant, then you need to find one and ask them whether or not, once you're collecting Social Security disability, if you have to file a tax return. You know, odds are, like the general population, some people are receiving benefits that are very low. Other people are receiving benefits that are at the maximum taxable rate, which now is a little over $3,000. If they have that in conjunction with other income, you know, from portfolios and whatever, the odds are pretty good they're going to have to file a return. But that's for an accountant. The other question with respect, I can't answer about New York, but I sit on a regional legal services board, and I can tell you that for Essex County, people should be reaching out for legal aid to the Essex County Legal Services Corporation. If you Google that, you'll get the phone number for the legal services, and they'll do a needs-based evaluation for SSI. With respect to the Patterson is covered under the board I'm on, which is Northern New Jersey Legal Services. And we too, they can call that number and we too will evaluate, or the services receptionist will send it to someone to evaluate whether or not they satisfy the needs-based requirements. And by the way, because attorneys can get fees in SSI cases, which when I first practiced many years ago, they couldn't, there are an awful lot of Social Security attorneys who are willing to take SSI cases as well. But let me get into the brass nuts, whatever. Let me get into the definition of long COVID and long haul COVID-19. Long haul COVID is something that we predicted pretty much out of the box was going to be an issue, because when people who have chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and disorders such as that, most of them develop those disorders after a serious viral issue that they had. Some of them had it after car accidents. Other people had it, you know, what causes myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia, there's no clear onset of those conditions. But many people had it after they suffered a severe flu-like disorder. So when this first all started, I was very concerned, and I was pretty convinced that people who had COVID might suffer a similar route. So over time in the last year, the definition has developed, and this is the definition that's generally followed. Those who suffer COVID-19 symptoms, weeks, months, or longer. And by the way, that doesn't require someone to test positive, because if you recall, in the early days of the pandemic, people weren't going to doctor's offices. They were calling their doctors, getting telehealth appointments, and the doctors were evaluating them based on their symptoms. And a lot of people were diagnosed based on symptoms. And by the time doctor's offices started opening up more, they were often not testing positive any longer. So it's not necessary that you have a positive COVID test to be determined to be someone with long COVID. Roughly 1/3 of COVID-19 patients who are not hospitalized have long-term illness. Now think about that. That's a large number, which we're going to get into in a little while. And as I said, no diagnosis of COVID-19 is necessary for people to, lots of people suspected they had it. They didn't have telehealth appointments with their doctors. They just kind of stayed home and were sick. So what happens in those cases? People who are still symptomatic and who suffer the classic COVID-19 symptoms, and it carries over for months, weeks, and maybe even now you're over the 1-year anniversary, you can be someone who's categorized as long COVID. Next slide, please. Yeah, there was a recent study that was actually, it got the most attention because it was published in the New York Times, but I gave you the Yahoo site that summarized the New York Times article. And this study was published in the journal Nature, and it was the largest study to review the array of long-term complications of COVID-19. What's fascinating about this is it was a profound study, but I'm not sure how broad-based its application is, because it was gotten from 73,000 people across the US whose COVID infections did not require hospitalization, but the numbers were obtained through the Department of Veteran Affairs health system. And the median age was much, much higher than that of the general population. So it's interesting, the study's interesting, the figures are interesting, but I'll just share with you the highlights of it. Between 1 and 6 months after infection, these patients who were found to experience very significant long-term health effects of COVID-19 had a significantly greater risk of death, more than 60% than those not infected by the virus. Now, I have to tell you, I've been speaking about long COVID for a while, and I've been teaching attorneys about long COVID for a while. That kind of took me by complete surprise. And then I got to the point in the study where they were talking about the median age being around 60, and then it made more sense because there's a higher mortality associated with an older population. The study also found that non-hospitalized COVID survivors had a 20% greater risk, greater chance of needing outpatient medical care over those 6 months than people who had not contracted the coronavirus. And that's the last line on this slide is what I was just saying, that this study may not be representative. So I don't want people who are listening who have long COVID to think that their life is over or that they're going to drop dead at any minute, because the study is really not representative of the long COVID general population because of the median age of those 73,000 people. And the breakdown is nearly 25% were Black, 88% were male with a median age of 61, 70% were white, and nearly 5% were other races. So please take a deep breath. I don't want anyone getting overly upset about this. Between 1 and 6 months after experiencing a relatively mild or moderate infection, roughly 2.3% died. It did not indicate what caused the death or anything specific about those patients' conditions. So once again, I don't want people panicking after reading this, because I have to confess, when I first read it, I said, oh my God, but it's really not something to be terribly panicked about. I mean, obviously it's not good for that population, but for many of the long COVID younger subjects, I wouldn't be worrying too much. Most of the 32 million people who have contracted the coronavirus have not required hospitalization. You know, what I was reading in a medical journal several months back was that coronavirus doesn't kill women generally. It affects them worse long term because they live with much more significant symptoms. Men are more likely, it's not that women don't die from COVID-19. It's that the ones who survive it, the women who survive it, survive often with significant issues in the months that follow. Men are more likely to die from COVID, but their long-term effects are not as significant as most women. Virtually every category of symptom, from chest pains to shortness of breath to diabetes to muscle weakness, were experienced by at least some of the people who were never hospitalized. Next slide, please. For the people who were hospitalized, their experiences involved significantly greater risk of long-term health complications than people hospitalized for seasonal flu. That's what the study found. And, you know, that's for the population out there who thinks that COVID-19 is nothing more serious than the flu. Well, the numbers quite beg to differ with that evaluation. They were more likely to develop or have persistent symptoms in a wide array of categories beyond respiratory manifestations, including neurological, cognitive, psychological, cardiovascular, metabolic, gastrointestinal, anemia, and blood clotting problems, as well as fatigue and malaise. And what we're going to be discussing soon is a study that was conducted by a survivors group in conjunction with the Indiana Medical School University that actually had, all these people went online in these survivor group chats, and they all participated in the study to chronicle what their symptoms were. And I'm introducing that to all of you today because most of us think about COVID-19 and the after effects, and we think respiratory issues, we think cardiac issues, and they are certainly there. But there are a number of other symptoms that either you, or if you're a social worker or a representative of some kind, people may walk into your office and you may say, well, that doesn't sound like COVID to me. I'm here to introduce you to a lot of symptoms that these survivors groups presented to that medical school and why I want you to be familiar with them. These are really a checklist of things you should be asking yourself if you had COVID or if you had COVID symptoms, and your clients or those you're trying to help. Because what you want to do is you want to ask each and every one so that you can document their case, and you can also recommend if they're going to a clinic, the type of physician they should be seeing, if they're participating in the Mount Sinai COVID group. They have clinics there, and they were the first in the country to start a long COVID clinic there. And they provide neurocognitive testing because there are a lot of volunteers who provide these services, and you really need to become familiar with those as well. Experts said the study's findings, we can go back to the other, experts said the study's findings reflect a cascade of issues driven not just by the virus, but by the medical system struggle to grapple with COVID-19. This is exactly what people talk about with myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. It is, you have to go to a number of experts to document all the different symptoms. And our medical system is so used to physicians looking through their particular lens that they don't often think about anything else. So if someone walks into a pulmonologist's office, that's for your breathing, and they say, oh, and I also have these GI issues, I can't stay awake, I can't sleep at night, I'm having pain in my calves, I'm having pain in my chest, they're just going to blank out, and they're only going to evaluate the case based on that. The medical system is used to looking through very specific lenses, so people with COVID, long COVID, have to be very proactive. We're going to talk about gaslighting physicians in a minute. Next slide, please. Yeah. These I created, the practice tips, because everyone who's either trying to do a Social Security application on their own or a social worker who's trying to help people file for these benefits, please, please, please listen to what I'm about to tell you. You want to thoroughly interview the client for long COVID symptoms. I go through, I have the chart, the graph, which is kind of tiny, but you can expand it if you get the PowerPoint on your own. You can expand it to see the incidence of these symptoms, and from most common to least common. But I've also delineated on separate slides all of the possible complaints people could be having. So you want, and you also, whenever you're doing these cases, whenever you're doing an SSI or an SSD case, you must go through every single thing. We do what we call a review of systems, like a physician does. We go from head to toe, and we ask people what they have problems with. Do you have headaches? Do you have nausea? Do you have visual disturbances? Do you have, debilitating fatigue? You do all that, so you get familiar with all the different things. People often forget, if someone had hypertension that was uncontrolled by medication, or if people are diabetics pre-COVID and then they get COVID. you need to know all of the things that's wrong with them, because the Social Security system works on a combination of impairments basis. You are not just, you know, people come to us sometimes, they've been in a motor vehicle accident, and they'll say, well, no, I had a heart condition, but that's not related to my car accident. I say, no, we're not personal injury attorneys here. We're disability lawyers. So you need to tell us every condition you suffer from. The next thing is you want to do some sort of vocational assessment. Well, for many of you, your clients haven't worked. That may not be as impactful, but if they have worked in any capacity, you want to know what their functional abilities were like pre-COVID, what their functional abilities are like post-COVID. If they had a job where they could work from home, why can't they do that now? Why are they applying for disability? What is it about the presentation of symptoms, their COVID symptoms, or any other symptoms that prevent them from doing that? Oftentimes you'll hear people saying when they're working from home and they can't work anymore, the fatigue is too debilitating. My cognitive issues are too bad. My autonomic nervous system, what's that? That's when the blood is not flowing properly through the your nervous system is not functioning properly. So you experience things like postural orthostatic tachycardia or neurally mediated hypotension. It affects your blood pressure, it affects your heart rate, it affects many, many things. So, and we're going to get to how people can simply test for those things. And they experience, when people are telling you they're experiencing dizziness and lightheadedness and heart palpitations that are unusual, that are really disturbing to them, usually they're going to have an autonomic nervous system problem. Next slide, please. List as many functional limitations as possible. Now, functional limitations, and anybody who practices in this area will tell you that is one of the most important things you want. Because if people can't do very basic activities anymore, basic activities of daily living, that is going to be their functional limitation issue. And when that happens, you've got to look at what they're complaining about, what medical conditions they've been diagnosed with, and see if they're reasonably related to these functional limitations. If somebody's saying, look, I can't sit for long because my back is killing me, then you want to make sure that you've got some medical support for the functional limitations complaints. You want to emphasize those limitations that directly affect the person's ability to perform their duties of any occupation or occupational work they've done in the past, or any occupational work they may be eligible for in the view of Social Security in the future. You have to objectively document as many functional limitations as possible. We're going to discuss this a little further on in the slides. And establish permanence of limitations. Now that's a bit of a challenge. If somebody just got diagnosed with COVID a few months ago, it's really challenging for any physician, including people treating people for COVID-19 issues. You can't necessarily say, well, they'll definitely experience this for 12 continuous months, which is the durational requirement in SSI and SSD. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that people keep a record of when they first started becoming symptomatic. For people who became symptomatic with COVID in March of last year and they're still symptomatic, well, arguably if they treat with a physician, even in a clinic, and the clinic says, yeah, they've been coming here, or they've been telling us about this. They've been telling us they've had this since last March. They've met this durational requirements. It's a little more challenging when you're talking about people who've only gotten sick or who've only manifested COVID symptoms a few months ago, because you have that 12-month durational requirement. Next slide, please. And as I said, permanence may be an issue, but you do what you can. People should be keeping, I say to people, old school, just keep a journal. Keep a journal of when this started. And I often tell them, ask family members, because family members are often much more acutely aware of what their family members are experiencing and how long they've been suffering from it. So if they're going to their physician or if they're going to a clinic, they should actually talk to they should actually have a family member or someone whose memory is good go with them, or bring their journal with them. Another thing is the presentation of symptoms. You know, some people get COVID and then they're okay and they go back to work, or they start trying to go back their normal life, and then a month or two later they start getting really sick again. Those people are another part of the long COVID population. They think they're out of the woods and then they crash again. So you want to ask things like, have these symptoms continued from the beginning? Does the person have good day and bad day presentation of symptoms? That's very common with long COVID. How exactly do the symptoms and limitations present in your client's case or in your case? And you want to document that. And it's important to do that because people don't necessarily know, because there are so many versions of long COVID. They're not necessarily sure how their case is any different than anybody else's. But that's why they need to journal it. That's why they need to watch it. And that's why they need to really think and maybe have someone in their family sit down with them and say, okay, how does it present in your particular case? And again, as I say, I can't emphasize enough journaling. Many doctors get you in and out, particularly if your clients are going to clinics. They're going to get them in and out. They don't want to sit and chat. Hand them for their file their journal entries, their notes that say, this is what I've been living with this. That way it's in the file so that you can get clinical documentation or correlation. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is critically important, and it's really difficult for people who don't have the funds to see a private physician. But gaslighting is a significant problem in this context. Long COVID patients, even those who go to private physicians, are often gaslighted, meaning they're being told you're just a little crazy. And the fact that long COVID impacts more women than men, and they think there may be a hormonal correlation for that, you're right back to some sexism at play here. Oh yeah, okay, you've got it, you've got everything. That's why documenting it in as many ways as possible is important. So you want to, if the person can afford it, or if they can get into one of the clinics that treat long COVID patients, they really need to do that. Because a bad physician, or one who doesn't believe in long COVID, or who doesn't believe that this particular person is going through long COVID, that can screw up a case more than anything else. And it's something you want to avoid like the plague. And again, if possible, if a person can afford it or can go to like the clinic at Mount Sinai, you want to recommend they undergo neuropsychological testing to objectively document symptoms. I mean, there's always, if you go to Social Security, a consultative examiner may say, okay, do serial sevens. You want to start at 100 and work back and just keep subtracting by 7. Well, that's not really valid neuropsych testing, but it's one that's commonly done and one that ALJs can just discard. You want to order medical records immediately and ongoing, and if possible, obtain a narrative report from the doctor and provide the medical evidence to Social Security as soon as it's received. As we all know, the Social Security bureaucracy is enormous, so these cases often take a long time, particularly with younger, long COVID people. The permanence issue is going to delay it. The lack of medical documentation may delay it. So everything you can do to push it forward is really important. Next slide, please. Yeah. According to Pew Trust research and analysis, determining the number of long COVID cases is uncertain. And that's because the numbers are all over the place, but there is no question that the numbers are going to be significant. Because as Dr. Ajala said, he's an infectious disease specialist at Johns Hopkins, said in October of 2020. At that time, there were 7 million infected overall. And he said long COVID is going to be a big number. So even if you have a small percentage of that 7 million, it's going to be substantial. Well, as of April 22nd, 2021, the number of infected was 31,666,546. Including 62,827 new cases as per the CDC. I have the site there. So even a small percentage of that is a lot of people who are going to be sick with long COVID. So I expect that this will be, the doors are going to be blown off in the next year or so with long COVID cases, because we're just now getting a handle on how significant people are affected once they're in COVID recovery. Next slide, please. Yeah. And this just goes on to talk about, you know, what the head of Mount Sinai's COVID-19 Recovery Center estimates the numbers are going to be, and the developing symptoms that persist for months. And he estimated then that it was going to be roughly 100,000 chronically sick people in New York State alone. But those numbers have been eclipsed, have been well eclipsed. And there are surveys that the numbers worldwide particularly are higher. There was a study in Ireland, a study in the Faroe Islands, a third much larger study in China. And the numbers are staggering for people who've developed long COVID sort of symptoms. And the problem is that now, it's not a problem, it's actually a good thing. Scientists have begun studying COVID patients with chronic symptoms because of the NIH is looking at it. Mount Sinai, as I said, has really been fabulous. And there's also NYU Langone, Yale, University of Iowa. These long COVID places are popping up all around the United States. And the likelihood that people will be able to get in with long COVID symptoms and perhaps get their testing done by volunteers who really understand the illness is a beautiful thing. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the graph I was talking about. And as you can see, we had to like make it, you know, make the font very small for this. But fatigue, cognitive problems, and other issues are in the top tier, respiratory issues. But what I did here is I also separately delineated on the slides that follow what a number of these symptoms are. And what I did was I produced them in order of the most significance in terms of the number of patients complaining of it to the least. So I itemized all of the symptoms based on the first symptoms you're going to see were the most prominent symptoms. And then as the slides go on, they're least. So if we can get to the next slide, please. Yes, fatigue, muscle or body aches, difficulty concentrating and remembering, that's cognitive deficits. Inability to exercise or be active, headache, difficulty sleeping, anxiety and memory problems. Those were the top tier complaints that people who reported to Indiana Medical University complained of. They were all part of the COVID survivors. Next slide, please. Dizziness, which is, again, part of that orthostatic hypotension. It's part of the autonomic nervous system problems. And these are things people can't control. So it's not as if you could say, well, they're making themselves dizzy. They're making their heart rate faster. I'm sure there are ways they can do it. But when a physician is checking them for it and they've got them hooked up to various monitors, they're going to see these things independently. Persistent cough. People think that people with COVID just cough. No, people with long COVID cough quite a bit. Joint pain, heart palpitations, diarrhea, gastrointestinal issues of every kind are very prominent here. Sore throats. Next slide, please. Night sweats, partial or complete loss of smell. There was someone who wrote and said, you know, I still have a loss of sense of smell, and I guess that's not a big deal. It is a very big deal. To lose your sense of smell. Ordinarily, in 35 years of practicing disability law, I can tell you that loss of sense of smell is very common among people with traumatic brain injuries. Therefore, I would not be surprised if the brain has been impacted by people who still continue to suffer loss of their sense of smell. It's as prominent a brain issue as cognitive issues. Tachycardia, the abnormally rapid heart rate, fevers or chills, hair loss, blurry vision, congested or runny noses. All of this doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're experiencing these things every day and it's wiping you out, that impacts your ability to work. Next slide, please. Sadness. This sounds silly to say, but many of these people reported sadness. People feel very upset. And so it could be secondary depression as a result of feeling all these other things, but it can also be, once again, the brain affected by COVID. And if it's long-term, feeling long-term sadness when you weren't long-term sad before is another significant issue. Neuropathy in the hands and feet, loss of sensation in the hands and feet. You'll see this in very severe diabetic cases, but to see this in someone without diabetes who's all of a sudden having neuropathic symptoms, and neuropathy can also present as pain and numbness, and that's very disabling. Reflux or heartburn, changing symptoms. So you may have some symptoms one week and the next week you have different symptoms, but if they all fall within the constellation of the symptoms we're discussing here today, you can bet it's a long COVID issue. Partial or complete loss of sense of taste. Again, exactly what we talked about before with loss of sense of smell. Phlegm in the back of the throat where you just can't clear it. Abdominal pain. Next slide, please. Lower back pain, which, as we know in the disability context, can be severely disabling. Shortness of breath, exhaustion from bending over, nausea or vomiting, waking, clogged ears, dry eyes, calf cramps. Next slide, please. Tremors or shakiness. These are all things people didn't have before. These were all things that suddenly, and some of them are in their 20s and 30s, they're waking up after having COVID symptoms, and then months later, they're suddenly being hit with a slew of these things. Upper back pain, floaters or flashes of light in the vision. Rashes are really common with long COVID. Often it's on the trunk, but I've had clients who've got it all over their face and don't know what to do because they just can't get rid of it and they've never had it before. It can also implicate not simply a dermatological issue, but it could be kidney damage because you'll often see rashes in people who have severe kidney dysfunction. Constant thirst, something we see quite often in diabetes. So perhaps the endocrine system is being impacted in significant ways. And the reason I'm going through all these things is so that you can see which one of the impairment listings you may want to tackle. The emergency message that Social Security came up with was interesting as far as it went, but you need to let your client know that the type of doctor they may need to see. When you've got nerve sensations, when you've got tinnitus, well, maybe they have to see at a clinic an ENT specialist. Nerve sensations, perhaps a neurologist. Constant thirst or the neuropathy symptoms, they may want to see an endocrine specialist because those are all the things that you have to start looking at in evaluating how people get treated for this. Next slide, please. Again, these are more changed sense of taste, sharp or sudden chest pain, confusion, muscle twitching, feeling irritable. The sharp or sudden chest pain may not even be cardiac. It may be muscular. And I'm going to talk about one of the slides that are coming up is cardochondritis, which is essentially a muscle issue that people who have post-viral syndromes often experience. The confusion, that's often cognitive. And now we went to talking about, okay, next slide, please. We said that people can gain weight. Well, they can lose weight. They may have postnasal drip, dry throat, high blood pressure, dry or peeling skin, swollen hands and feet. Often when we see swollen hands and feet, we're thinking cardiac. It could also be something else. And part of the problem is they're not sure why all these symptoms are happening. But it's often important for people who have those sorts of symptoms to see a specialist that might be able to look at them, and at least if they have a cardiac issue, they need to document it. If they don't have a cardiac issue, then they eliminate that and send them somewhere else. It could be some type of orthopedic result from long COVID. Heat intolerance, mouth sores or sore tongue. They call it COVID tongue often when people have these sore tongues. And it is very disturbing. But again, they have to see a physician who can look at their tongue and say, what's this? And at least they know there's some documentation for it. Next slide, please.
Barbara,
Yes.
I want to note that we don't have too much time left.
Okay, I'm just gonna let them look at these things.
Great.
Let's just move through the slides, because one of the things I want you to see is all the sorts of symptoms. The ones that are more painful or prominent, I define what they are so that the people who are helping them have a sense. They can explain this to people. Do you have COVID toes? They can say to them what it is.
Flipping through this, everyone, feel free to send your questions, and then we'll rapid fire questions in a couple minutes.
Okay. One of the things I did want to discuss is, however, the types of testing that people can go through. If you go through all of these slides, I recommend certain tests for people who have the most common problems. And that is people who are suffering the cognitive problems. They can undergo neurocognitive testing. People who have good day and bad day presentation of symptoms, they may be able to function almost normally one day, and then they have to rest. They crash terribly, and for days they have to rest. Cardiopulmonary exercise testing, which I believe is going to be offered in some of these long COVID clinics, can document whether that's a cardiac oxygen deprivation or other things. And again, it's medical documentation. A very simple test for autonomic nervous system complaints. Years ago, they only had tilt table tests. They put people on a tilt table and they moved them upside down. And if they passed out, they had cardiac issues that could be confirmed, autonomic nervous system issues that could be confirmed. There's a much simpler test. It's called the Nasoline test, where people have their blood pressure monitored in a supine position, meaning laying flat on a table. They measure their blood pressure and they see whether or not their blood pressure is normal. And after about 10 minutes of constantly monitoring that blood pressure, they have a baseline blood pressure reading. And I discuss all this in the slides. When they stand after that, they then can lean their shoulder blades against a wall and move their feet about 6 inches apart. And a physician, after 10 minutes, will start monitoring blood pressure. If there's been a big drop, then there's an autonomic nervous system issue. I discuss all this in the slides. I'm sorry, I only have 15 minutes. I'm doing the best I can. But if anybody has any questions about any of this, please feel free to call me. My office number, my law office is in Paramus, New Jersey. Our number is 201-444-4493. We represent clients all throughout the United States, but I am very happy to answer any questions you may have. So I tried to wrap it up quickly.
Thank you.
And my final practice tips are on the very last slide. So.
Okay. Okay, great. So everyone, please send your last questions. There's a question that came up. I'm not sure who might be able to answer it, but it was in reference to the behavioral health population. This may be for Anne, but it was a reference to the behavioral health population. Is recertification still a requirement to obtaining benefits?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Yeah, I don't either.
Okay.
The only
pertaining
to SSI, sorry,
I was saying whoever asked it, feel free to clarify in the chat.
the one thing I wonder is sometimes for SSI, they will do a review periodically of whether you remain disabled. And so what that makes me wonder is if somebody is found disabled for a psychiatric diagnosis, maybe they review it in 2 years to see if you remain depressed enough to still be considered disabled, just as an example. But otherwise, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking.
Hopefully that person can clarify if they have more questions about that in the chat.
Okay.
There's a question about the Ticket to Work program. If you could explain how many hours a recipient can work without losing their benefit.
The Ticket to Work program is something I will tell you I never encourage anyone to participate in. Since its inception, it is often used as a justification to terminate benefits for people. It is a very slippery slope, and it is a very, in my opinion, it's not worth the effort. If people want to attempt a work attempt, they can do it by just engaging in what they call either while their application is pending after they've satisfied the durational requirement, they can try what's called an unsuccessful work attempt, which allows them to work up to 6 months, or they can make a trial work period attempt. The Ticket to Work program is, honestly, it's something it's really pushed very hard by Social Security, particularly after the Trump administration, not to get political, but they really pushed it very hard. And it was a disaster for just about every client. I mean, our phones ring off the hook all the time with people getting terminated after Ticket to Work. So if you want to try a work attempt, try a work attempt after you've been adjudicated favorably for Social Security. That's my advice.
Thank you. Any other questions? Feel free to add them in the chat. In the meantime, I've also dropped a link to a survey in the chat. Please feel free to fill it out. It's super short. We offer these trainings throughout the year, and we would love to continue to offer trainings and sessions that are meaningful and helpful to you all. So please fill that out if you have a chance. I'll give everyone one more minute to ask any questions, and representatives, if there's anything else you want to share, please feel free.
Hey, Tess, I just see one question here. I heard that you can take a 20% reduction in SSI benefits if you're not disabled and applying. I don't know if we got to that one yet.
Do they mean SSD?
Possibly. Is there such a thing as a 20% reduction in benefits?
Well, there is a 20% reduction in benefits for early retirement. So if you're applying for Social Security disability and you hit age 62, or as Carlissa said, right before age 62, and make application for early retirement, generally speaking, filing for early retirement will leave you with about, it used to be everybody retired at age 65. Now they have different ages where people hit full retirement age. So if you're someone who is applying at age 62 for early retirement, you're generally going to get between 70 to 75% of the retirement benefit you'd get at full retirement age. The problem is that if you just apply for early retirement, right, if you have your insured status in place, and if you apply for early retirement and you don't get Social Security disability, that number, you're going to be stuck with that number for the rest of your life. That's the exchange the government gives you. If, however, as Carlissa said, at early retirement age, you simultaneously apply for Social Security disability, you can then be made whole if your Social Security disability is approved. So you can get a benefit right away, and that's your retirement benefit. And then when your Social Security is approved, you go from 75% or so to the full amount of your disability, of your retirement benefit when you're approved for Social Security. Because like Ann was saying with SSI, you transition from, at a certain age, you transition from a disability benefit right into a retirement benefit. And again, it depends on when that occurs, depends on what your date of birth is and when you hit full retirement age under Social Security.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Can someone apply on behalf of a hospitalized person for Social Security benefits, even if the hospitalized person's assets are over 10,000?
Well, if they have insured status under Social Security, as Carlissa was explaining, 20 out of 40 credits, 20 out of 40 quarters covered, or if they have, if they're a younger individual and they have the quarters met, then they can apply. There's, as Ann was saying, there's no means testing for Social Security disability for Title II. There's mean testing for SSI. So I'm assuming that if someone's got lots of assets and they're in the hospital, it becomes difficult. But yes, if somebody is, let's say someone has funds, but they are qualified for Social Security disability, they can elect someone to file on their behalf as their representative.
If a client is denied for SSI benefits, how long after until they can reapply?
Okay, and I'm going to give that one to you.
Oh, okay, so if they're denied for SSI, they kind of have the choice to either appeal it or reapply. And so if they decide not to appeal it, they could reapply right away. But they should know that they will only be paid if approved on the new application date, not the old application date. Whereas if you keep the old application and you appeal, even if you appeal, and eventually get it, they could pay you back to the original application date as long as they find that you were disabled starting then. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can a parent get SSI for a disabled child who lives with the family because the parents are unable to care for the child?
So the word parent is used twice in that question. So it sounds like an adult who's caring for a disabled child, but that child is not living with their parents. They could apply for SSI if they are like responsible for that kid, and they could be the payee. They would have to show what their relationship to the child is and how that is the kid's living with them. And then we'd have to think about whether their income, it depends on their relationship. The income of parents and resources of parents can be deemed to the child when deciding if they're financially eligible for SSI or not. So if it's actually the parent, it would be deemed. If it's not actually the parent and it's not an adoptive parent or a step parent, then I don't think their income counts. This is a little bit more than you were asking. Somebody in that situation, I think, who thinks the child is disabled enough to get SSI should make the attempt to apply and then kind of work it through the system.
We have 2 more questions and then I will close. Thank you both so much. How long can you be out of the country for and continue to receive SSI benefits?
No longer than 30 days.
Okay, great.
And you have to report that you've gone, and you have to report when you come back.
Great.
And by the way, there are limitations as well for Social Security disability. There are certain countries that we have treaties with that they'll let them stay there longer and collect their benefits, but you really have to look to see what the country that you're, because a lot of people apply for benefits and then they go back to their country of origin, and Social Security is a little funny about that. But if we have a treaty with that country that honors reciprocal benefits, then they're okay.
Last question, and I think I'm interpreting this correctly. In the case of a written statement for an appeal, does it have to be a literal written letter, or can it be typed and signed by the client?
Whether you're talking about a written appeal or a written statement about good cause, written just means on paper. It can be typed and signed by the client.
That is it for us. We are out of time. Thank you all so much. I hope this was helpful, and if you have other questions, please feel free to email them, and we'll see what we can do on our end to help everyone out. And later I'll be sharing the slides, the presentation, as well as phone numbers and email addresses. I hope you can all join us on May 6th next week for our Bronx Interagency Case Conference, where if you have any challenges with any clients or patients, you can come and we'll workshop the issue together with a group of colleagues and experts. And Wednesday, May 19th, we have a CAPS training. So I will send all of this information out in email, but I want to thank Barbara and Anne and Carlissa for all of their guidance on this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.